This is an official Watchtower article on jw.org. It is an article about consoling adult survivors of childhood trauma. It opens with a story about a young woman suffering from severe depression, self-hatred, and thoughts of unaliving herself. She had been essayed as a child, and the article's opening line tells us that the elder who visited her was thankful that Jehovah's organization has provided direction on how to help the victims of such crimes. The article then goes on to give guidance on how to listen, how to speak consolingly, and how to help trauma survivors replace harmful lies about themselves, lies that abuse teaches children, the article says, with the truth. Now, the Watchtower wrote this article about healing childhood trauma, and I want to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes showing you something that the article never once mentions. That the Watchtower organization itself is one of the primary causes of the childhood trauma it is claiming to help heal. Not in isolated cases, not in the actions of a few bad actors. Systemically, structurally, in the documented, published official teachings and practices of the organization that wrote this article. So let's talk about it. Now let me summarize what this Watchtower article actually says, because understanding its claims is essential before we examine the gap between those claims and the organization's actual practices. The article opens with a woman in severe depression who had been essayed as a child. It tells elders to listen, to empathize, to expose the lies that abuse teaches, that the victim is dirty, unlovable, worthless. It tells elders to speak consolingly, to avoid simplistic advice like just read the Bible more or throw your burden on Jehovah. It acknowledges that telling abuse survivors to simply forget the past might do more harm than good. There is some genuinely sound pastoral instinct in parts of this article. The recognition that empathy matters more than answers, that trauma survivors need to be heard rather than fixed, that premature spiritual advice can re-traumatize rather than comfort. And these are things that trained trauma therapists would recognize as directionally correct. But here's what the article never once asks. Where did this trauma come from? What environment produced this child's abuse? What role did the organization play in the circumstances that led to this woman sitting in front of an elder with ideation of taking her own life? The article treats childhood trauma as something that arrives from outside, from the world, from bad actors in the darkness beyond the kingdom wall. It positions the organization as the solution, the healer. It never once considers that for millions of children raised inside this organization, the Watchtower itself is the source. Now let me walk you through 7 specific documented organization-sanctioned practices that clinical psychology identifies as causes of childhood trauma and religious trauma syndrome. Every one of these practices is taught, enforced, or encouraged by the same organization that wrote this article about healing childhood trauma. Number 1 is corporal punishment. Anyone raised as a Jehovah's Witness will have endured being hit or watched children being taken to the back room of the Kingdom Hall for punishment. This is not anecdotal. The Watchtower's own publications have explicitly advocated physical discipline of children across decades of published guidance. The 1973 Watchtower stated, it shows real love on the part of a parent to do whatever he can to correct his child, including spanking him. A 1974 publication stated, spanking may be a lifesaver to a child. And it cited Proverbs directly, with the rod you yourself should beat him, that you may deliver his very soul from Sheol itself. Now, this guidance was published, distributed to millions of members, and applied in kingdom halls around the world. There are reports of the Watchtower conductor in one congregation was described by a witness as stepping off the platform and hitting his daughter in front of the entire congregation. Now, the article we are examining today acknowledges that abuse teaches children that they are dirty, unlovable, worthless. What it does not acknowledge is that the organization telling parents to beat their children with a rod is teaching those same lessons in exactly the same way. Hey, before I get back into today's topic, I need to tell you about something that has been in the works for a while now, and I'm genuinely excited about this. You know Dalsin Tola? You've seen her on this channel, author of Finding Truth with Michael, licensed clinical social worker, trauma-informed therapist, and someone who lived the story we talk about on this channel from the inside. Well, Dolls and I are launching a podcast together. We are going to be unpacking religious trauma and harm, the terminology, the psychology, the pathways to healing and deconstruction in a way that is honest, rigorous, and human. The first episode drops very soon, so follow this channel now so you do not miss it. And if you know someone who needs this conversation, someone who is just beginning to find their way out, or someone who has been out for years and still carrying what they left with, share this with them. This is the conversation we need to have and been waiting to have. And it starts soon. Now back to today's episode. Number 2, the Armageddon terror. Constant reminders of an impending Armageddon create a climate of fear and urgency, discouraging critical thinking or dissent. And children raised inside this organization are told from their earliest years that the world outside the congregation is about to be destroyed by God, that billions of people, their teachers, their neighbors, their friends at school, will die horribly unless they join the organization. That Armageddon would come at any moment, that they must always be spiritually ready, that any moment of doubt or wavering could cost them their survival and survival of everyone they love. This is the literal teaching delivered at Kingdom Hall meetings, at conventions, through publications, through children's books, through the jw.org videos produced specifically for children, showing families surviving Armageddon while billions of others perish around them. Clinical psychologists identify chronic fear of catastrophic punishment as a primary cause of childhood anxiety disorders and complex PTSD. And the Watchtower delivers that fear systematically to every child in every congregation every week. And then number 3, social isolation. Children are raised with strict rules and limited exposure to ideas outside of the organization, effectively isolating them from the wider world. Birthday parties are banned. Christmas is banned. Extracurricular activities that conflict with meetings are discouraged. Friendships with non-witness children, worldly children, in the organization's language, are actively discouraged on the grounds that bad association spoil useful habits. The result is that children raised inside this organization grow up in a social world that extends no further than the congregation. They have no friendships outside, no social skills practiced in context the organization has not approved, no experience on the normal social rituals of childhood. When they reach adulthood, whether they stay or leave, they face the world with social development that has been systematically stunted by an organization that called the stunting spiritual protection. Number 4, shame and worthlessness. The Watchtower article we are examining identifies a core wound of trauma survivors, the belief that they are dirty, unlovable, and worthless. It says abuse teaches children these lies. And here's what the organization also teaches children: that they are born in sin and inherently imperfect, that their natural impulses, curiosity, social connection, ambition, sexual development are spiritually dangerous, that questioning the organization's teachings is a sign of spiritual weakness that displeases Jehovah, that worldly success, academic achievement, and personal ambition are spiritually suspect, that their worth is measured entirely by their field service hours, their meeting attendance, and their compliance with organizational rules. And many ex-believers have anger about the abuse of growing up in a world of lies. They feel robbed of normal childhood, honest information, and the opportunity to develop and thrive. The shame the Watchtower article identifies as the legacy of abuse is also the primary emotional product of the Watchtower's own teachings about who its children are and what they are worth. Number 5 is thought control and loaded language. Now, every high control group develops an internal vocabulary that creates a barrier between members and outside reality. The Watchtower is no exception. Worldly, apostate, the truth, faithful and discreet slave, spiritual paradise. These words mean something entirely different inside the organization than outside it. For children raised inside the system, these words are not theological concepts they learned and evaluated. They are the water they swim in, the categories through which they perceive every experience. A child who learns to classify all non-members as worldly, all questioning as apostate thinking, all outside information as spiritually dangerous, that child has had their capacity for independent thought systematically dismantled before they are old enough to consent to the process. And religious trauma syndrome involves symptoms such as guilt, shame, fear of divine punishment, anxiety, and depression that persists beyond the individual's departure from a religious community. These symptoms do not develop in adulthood from a single harmful event. They develop in childhood from years of systematic cognitive conditioning. The Watchtower does that conditioning deliberately, thoroughly, and by design. 6, shunning and family severance. Now, each year, approximately 70,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, around 1% of the total membership, are disfellowshipped and subsequently shunned. Only 1/3 return to the religion, the remainder having their family ties severed for life. And for a child who grew up inside this organization, that statistic is not abstract. It means that every relationship they have ever formed, every friend, every family member, every person who has ever mattered to them exists within the same organization, and that if they ever leave or are pushed out, every one of those relationships ends by organizational instruction permanently. Research published in peer-reviewed journals confirms that shunning has a long-term detrimental effect on mental health, on job possibilities, and life satisfaction. Problems are amplified in female former members due to heavy themes of sexism and patriarchal narratives, which are pervasive in Jehovah's Witness culture. And social ostracism activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. This has been demonstrated in neuroimaging studies by Kipling Williams at Purdue. Shunning is not merely unpleasant. It causes measurable neurological harm. And the Watchtower instructs every parent to apply it to their children if those children leave. And then number 7, CSA and institutional cover-up. The Watchtower article we began with opens with a survivor of CSA sitting in front of an elder with thoughts of self-harm ideation. The article instructs the elders to help people like her. It does not acknowledge that the organization's own 2-witness rule, requiring a second witness to an allegation of abuse before any congregation action can be taken, has functioned for decades as a structural shield for abusers within congregations. Children who were abused inside this organization reported to elders who were instructed to call the legal department of the Watchtower, not the police. Children who disclosed abuse were often required to confront their abusers in judicial committee meetings. And then they were told, sometimes by the same elders who had just placed them in a room with their abuser, that Jehovah's organization provides direction on how to help victims of such crimes. And I want to name what I think is the deepest irony of this article. The Watchtower article on consoling adult survivors of childhood trauma does something that this organization does in every piece of literature it produces about harm. It positions the organization as the solution to a problem while systematically avoiding any acknowledgement of the organization's role in creating it. The article identifies the lies that trauma teaches, and it instructs elders to replace those lies with the truth. But the truth the article prescribes is entirely Watchtower truth. More scripture, more trust in Jehovah, more reliance on organizations' guidance. The solution to trauma caused in significant part by the organization's own teachings and practices is more of the organization's teachings and practices. Jehovah's Witnesses, with their strict doctrines and dogma, shunning practices and isolation from mainstream society, are often considered one of the highest risk groups for developing religious trauma syndrome. The symptoms: guilt, shame, fear of divine punishment, anxiety, depression, difficulty trusting one's own judgment, are not incidental to the organization's practices. They are a direct product of them. A child who is abused and then placed by elders in a room with his or her abuser as part of a judicial committee process, who is told that the matter must remain confidential for the good of the congregation, who is discouraged from seeking outside professional help because psychiatry is viewed with suspicion by the organization, a stance that they've apparently softened in recent times. That child's trauma is not solely the product of the original abuse. It is the product of everything that happened after it inside a system designed to contain rather than heal. The Watchtower article says, listen, listen, listen. The organization's structural response to child abuse says, call the legal department, keep it confidential, do not go to the authorities. These two instructions cannot coexist. And the article never notices the contradiction because it was never designed to. And let me tell you what the clinical research actually says about childhood trauma and high control religious environments, because the Watchtower article cites scripture. I want to cite peer-reviewed journals. A 2023 study published in the journal Mental Health, Religion, and Culture, examining the health and well-being of former Jehovah's Witnesses in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, found that former members reported significantly elevated rates of childhood maltreatment and adverse childhood experiences compared to general population norms. Religious trauma syndrome has gained increasing scholarly and clinical attention as reports of psychological and spiritual distress linked to religious environments emerge across diverse contexts worldwide. Research documents symptoms including guilt, shame, fear, anxiety, and depression that persist beyond the individual's departure from a religious community. And children raised inside Jehovah's Witnesses can accumulate multiple adverse childhood experiences simultaneously: physical punishment, emotional neglect through social isolation, psychological abuse through Armageddon terror, and shame-based doctrine, household dysfunction through parental compliance with shunning demands, exposure to institutional cover-up of abuse within their immediate community. None of these accumulate as a single catastrophic event. They accumulate as the background radiation of a childhood, the constant low-level systematic exposure to an environment in which the child's natural needs for autonomy, curiosity, social connection, and safety are constantly subordinated to the organization's requirements. The Watchtower article tells elders that trauma survivors may need to hear repeatedly and patiently that they have valid reasons for feeling the way they do. That is clinically sound. But the valid reasons the article has in mind are the abuse that happened in the dark, not the doctrine that happened in the light. The child who grew up believing they were worthless for not preaching enough hours has valid reasons for feeling the way they do. The teenager who lost every friend they had ever known because they asked a question has valid reasons. The adult who cannot make a decision without checking whether Jehovah approves has valid reasons. And those reasons have a name now: religious trauma syndrome. complex PTSD, adverse childhood experiences. The clinical language exists, the research exists, and none of it appears in the Watchtower article about healing childhood trauma because the organization that published that article is not capable of naming itself as a cause. And I want to be clear about something before I close. Genuine healing from religious trauma and childhood trauma is possible. People do recover. The clinical tools exist. The therapists who specialize in this work are out there. And the community of survivors, people who have lived this childhood and found their way through to the other side, is one of the most generous and supportive communities I've encountered in any context. But genuine healing requires something the Watchtower article cannot provide. It requires the ability to name what actually happened. Not just the abuse in the dark, the doctrine in the light, the shunning at the podium, the judicial committee that placed a child in a room with her abuser, the elder who called the legal department instead of the police, the birthday party that was never allowed, the friend who was lost to a letter and asked too many questions. Many survivors feel robbed of a normal childhood, honest information, and the opportunity to develop and thrive. They have rage because they dedicated their lives and gave up everything to serve an organization masquerading as God's spokespeople on earth. They are angry about losing their families and their friends. They feel enormously betrayed. That is not dysfunction. It's an accurate response to what was done. Naming it accurately is the beginning of healing it genuinely. The Watchtower article instructs elders to expose the lies that abuse teaches, the belief that the survivor is dirty and unlovable and worthless. That instruction is right. But the lies that need exposing are not only the ones abuse teaches, they're also the ones doctrine teaches. The lie that your worth is measured by your field service hours, the lie that everyone outside the congregation is spiritually dangerous, the lie that questioning is apostasy, the lie that the organization is Jehovah's channel and therefore cannot be questioned, the lie that what happened to you inside its walls is something only the organization can heal. Those lies need exposing too, and the Watchtower is structurally incapable of exposing them because they are the foundation on which everything else is built. If you are a survivor of religious trauma, whether from this organization or any other, please know that genuine help exists outside the system that harmed you. The ex-JW counseling community can assist. Therapists trained in complex PTSD and trauma-informed care, and communities of survivors who know exactly what you lived through because they lived through it too. You have valid reasons for feeling the way you do. All of them, including the ones the Watchtower article never mentions. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video. And if you grew up inside this organization and recognize the childhood I have just described, drop it in the comments. Your experience is the evidence that matters most. See you next time.